In the modern West, or the postmodern West, or in the first world in general, we see that mainstream narratives allow for tribalism of the sort that some folks on the right tend to criticize only as a gesture of hostility against the dominant culture. It's not that we're breaking down into tribes, it's that tribalism is weaponized by dominant discourse, by mainstream media, against whatever is prevalent in a culture. So, yeah, you get the girl boss that has a particular identity and a strong sense of self, but only as a gesture against the patriarchy, only as an aggressive stance against men. And certain minority ethnic identities are celebrated, but usually only if they are being presented as opposed to the dominant ethnic identity of a given country.
The white British population has decreased by 600,000, while the minority population has increased by 1.2 million. So, yes, lads, we're winning.
It's not really a celebration, for example, of African American culture that you get in mainstream media. It's the instrumentalization of African American tropes against white supremacy or white privilege or whatever else.
White men like Trump need to be banished. White men.
Things are not really celebrated on their own terms. And it's not only against the West or against European derived culture that this is happening. It's a feature in general of elite discourse to oppose whatever is historically established, whatever has strong identity over time. For example, there's this documentary, which is actually very good, from the BBC about Africa, African culture, African identity. I enjoyed it, but it conspicuously lashes out against strong identities, even in Africa.
Although the Asante are one of the best defined groups in Africa today, they are in fact the product of much mixing over the centuries. The fusion of African with Arab, some Indian, and later European influences is what we describe as the Swahili culture.
This is significant because it gives us an example of mainstream discourse being used not to break down a Western or European derived identity, but in this case, African identities. And in fact, Asante and Swahili culture, which are two of the most characteristic cultures of Africa. In the Asante case, in fact, we're dealing with a politically articulated identity. They should be thought of as units, not as mere combinations of elements. And you get the same thing with Swahili as a language. This is primarily an African Bantu identity. It's not part African, part Middle Eastern, part European, part Indian. It has foreign elements, but that's just what they are. They're foreign elements. That's not the essence. The essence is African. And to try to obfuscate that or break that down is a way of robbing people, in a sense, of their sense of self, their groundedness, and their capacity to project their identity and their interests on the world stage. It isn't that it's inaccurate to describe the composition of a thing, the parts that went into making an identity over time. It's that there's a certain allergy to defining identity in its own terms as a unitary, cohesive whole in terms of its own essence and not the various parts. It's like describing a person only in terms of their organs, or only in terms of what they have in common with every other person, never in terms of what makes them a specific, particular person. Because anything that's coherent is a threat. It has its own vector, its own will. And if you're coming to a negotiating table, the best thing you can do is convince the other part that he doesn't even exist. You're not really a particular person with particular interests and particular loyalties to your family or nation. You're just a human being in general, right? Pure abstraction. Or you're just a collection of organs. You're not really one entity. You're many entities. You don't exist. Nations don't exist. They're just a random assortment of people. So that's reductionism. Abstraction and reduction. Death from above, death from below, that psychological fear of the coherence of other bodies.